So I'm pleased today to launch our new national strategy for the integration of persons with disabilities.
Prime Minister Mulroney unveils a 5-year strategy on disability. Is it window dressing or the real thing?
Hello and welcome to an all-new season of DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. Because of its importance to people with disabilities, we're going to devote the entire program to the federal government's national strategy for the integration of disabled persons. Details of the plan were announced by Prime Minister Mulroney in Winnipeg in early September.
People with disabilities are reacting both positively and negatively to the announcement. They'll tell us why.
We'll also get reaction from disability rights advocates and opposition critics.
The government went to a lot of trouble and expense to ensure maximum coverage of the Prime Minister's announcement. Leaders of the disabled community were invited to Winnipeg to hear the Prime Minister's speech. The government's public relations people bought an hour of satellite time to ensure that the message reached all corners of the country. And we'll hear later, the media didn't show much interest.
Now let's begin this special report by hearing part of what Prime Minister Mulroney had to say to his Winnipeg audience.
Disability cuts across all sectors of society, affecting all regions, all age groups, all economic levels, and all backgrounds without exception. Persons with disabilities are our families, our neighbors, and our friends. Most of the disabled persons in Canada can be fully productive members of society. Most want nothing more, most expect nothing more, and most will settle for nothing less. Persons with disabilities, in my experience, neither ask for special sympathy nor expect special privilege. All they ever ask for is equal access. But every day, they encounter unnecessary obstacles in housing and education, in employment and transportation, in communications and recreation. And so I'm pleased today to launch our new national strategy for the integration of persons with disabilities. This 5-year program will cost $158 million, and it has 3 key goals: equal access, economic integration, and effective participation by Canadians with disabilities in the mainstream of our national life.
The National Strategy for the Integration of Persons with Disabilities will be implemented through 10 federal departments and will focus on the following key areas: access to employment and training opportunities. In partnership with employers, training institutions, and labor, the initiative proposes to provide employment and training opportunities. Access to transportation. Provide financial incentives to the transportation industry on a partnership basis to encourage the use of equipment that would improve accessibility. Access to housing. Promote barrier-free housing design and provide financial assistance for older disabled persons who need home modifications. Access to communications. Ensuring that library information is widely available in alternative formats. Community integration. Supporting the development of independent living centers and improving the coordination of services for Aboriginal persons with disabilities, and promoting service models and pilot projects which promote the integration of disabled Canadians into society.
On September 6, when Prime Minister Mulroney announced the strategy, he made one specific project commitment: $175,000 to the Canadian Disability Rights Council to fund legislative research and community consultation.
On September 9th, Secretary of State Roberta Cotre announced the following commitments in Montreal. As part of the $158 million allocated to the strategy, $38 million would be spent on the following programs within the Secretariat. Increased funding of $14 million to the Disabled Persons Participation Program. Development of a new partnership fund in the amount of $17 million. And $7 million to establish a national clearinghouse to provide expert advice on Canadian models of integration and accessibility.
In addition, funding went to the following organizations: L'Alliance des regroupements des transports adaptés du Québec will receive $20,000 to evaluate the accessibility of transportation systems in Quebec. L'Association multiethnique pour l'intégration des personnes handicapées will receive $35,000 to assess the barriers which limit the participation of disabled persons.
Coming up, reactions to the national strategy. Over the last few weeks, people with disabilities have had time to think about the government's national strategy for the integration of persons with disabilities. We met some of these people at a downtown Toronto hotel. They were there to see Access Awards handed out by the Ontario government.
When their thoughts turned to the federal government's initiative, this is what they told me.
Well, watching him on television, I was quite impressed with the amount of money that they were prepared to come ahead and spend on the disabled.
Excuse me if I laugh, right? I have to, you know, really. I don't believe in any of his promises. I mean, we've been getting those right from the very beginning. $158 million, how much of that is new money? As far as I'm concerned, or I've heard, over 30% of that money is old money. So, you know, where's the big thing he's coming in at?
Well, it certainly isn't enough, but in these recessionary times, I think we really have to be understanding. And we really well remember and hold him accountable once times get better. Then I think he owes us. He's going to have to come forward with more money.
Well, I agree with his strategy almost completely. One area that it failed to mention in the reports I've read is education for other than the disabled. The public needs to be made aware of the disabled's abilities and their special requirements and needs, but mostly their abilities. With that, a lot of the unemployment will just pretty well go away.
Joe, as we heard, the government is spending $158 million over the next 5 years. I asked our guests how they thought the money should be spent.
Basically on employment, getting more people into the employment force and making sure they're properly educated for the job that they want to get into.
Well, I think, you know, all the different programs and services are being set up, but they're not going to help at all unless we educate the people, unless we educate the public and the corporations. But I think the one person that must be educated is Brian Mulroney himself. He's the leader. He's supposed to be the leader. And I think he needs to be educated.
Transportation, number one, accessibility, and then attendant care. I think there's many areas, but I think nationally, transportation, we have to be able to move across this country. Freedom to move is life itself, you know, that's the old saying.
I think I would really like to see it in mobility and housing.
Sue, did people feel that their lives might be improved directly by the strategy?
In some cases, Joe, people had almost thrown in the towel. They didn't expect much. Others were optimistic that the strategy would make a difference to their lives.
Well, it's going to help me as far as my house being renovated. I'm waiting right now for renovations, and it's going to help pay for them.
It's probably not going to change things for me that much, or only minimally at best. It's a very long-term fight. 20, 25, 30 years before even large parts of what's left to be done is done.
Because I travel so much, I certainly hope that it'll make our transportation easier. And if the planes are more accessible, and if we have more taxis in the city of Toronto that are accessible, it'll certainly help me.
So the response was a mixture of skepticism and optimism.
Yeah, but people seem to have higher expectations. They're now looking for commitment and action from the government. And as a final question, I asked them if they had any advice for the Prime Minister.
Make sure he follows through on it, because he's going to get a lot of angry people out there, because we're citizens and we deserve, finally, we deserve some equal opportunity.
Put it near the top of your list. I think the disabled community really needs the support of the government to be more a part of society. We just want to be ordinary citizens. We want to work and play like everybody else, and I think it's our right.
As we said, those men and women were attending an awards ceremony in Toronto. The Community Action Awards, presented by the Ontario Office for Disability Issues, honors people who've advanced the goals of integration and independence for people with disabilities. We'll bring you interviews with some of the award winners in future programs.
When we come back, we'll have more reaction to the federal government's 5-year strategy from disability rights advocates. We're back with more on Brian Mulroney's promises to people with disabilities.
Access to transportation, education, housing, employment. These are all issues addressed in the federal government's national strategy. As we reported last year, the same concerns were dealt with by the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, in the United States. That act was signed into law by President Bush before a huge audience of disabled people. That act sets very specific deadlines for action. For example, in the area of public accommodation, all physical barriers must be removed by January the 26th, 1992. If that can't be done, then alternative methods of providing service must be offered.
Disability rights advocates in Canada want the federal government to impose the same kind of tough rules in this country. They are working on a legislative package to present to the government. They call it omnibus legislation. Unlike Mulroney's national strategy, which is a government initiative, omnibus legislation would be based solely on the grassroots concerns of disabled people, as was the ADA in the United States.
Susan spoke with 3 people who are involved in the process of defining omnibus legislation. Cathy McPherson is a member of the Canadian Disability Rights Council. Carol McGregor is the coordinator of Disabled People for Employment Equity, and Diane Richler is the executive director of the Canadian Association for Community Living. Sue asked Ms. Richler if she thought the national strategy would promote the integration of people with disabilities.
I wish I could say yes. Unfortunately, despite the fact that the announcement was already made a month ago, there's still very little detail that's been made available to the public. And the little bit that we do know doesn't give any indication that there are going to be any major changes in the lives of people with disabilities in Canada.
Now, if you were Mr. Decotre and sitting in his position, how would you want to see those funds allocated?
Well, I think the first priority for me would have been to stop penalizing people for being disabled. And unfortunately, that was not the starting point of this initiative from what I can understand. It seems that what the government is trying to do is to compensate for existing policies that are setting people with disabilities apart from the community and trying to move them forward a little bit rather than eliminating the barriers that are keeping them out of the general workforce and out of participating in their communities.
Do you see, Ms. McGregor, that this will help promote employment equity over the next 5 years with the plan that they've laid out?
Oh, not at all, Susan. We're very disappointed with this document as a working document towards employment for people with disabilities. The only thing that we've really gotten out of this document is that instead of 1 week of National Access Awareness Week, we're going to have 52 weeks of Access Awareness Week. We don't need further education. We need timetables, specific timetables to get people into the workforce. We need mandatory employment equity legislation, and the government is simply backing off. They're simply saying, we're going to educate employers, we're going to educate unions, we're going to educate the public to see what these poor disabled people can do. Mm-hmm. And we know what we can do. We know that we're capable of working, and we're going right back to square one. I think it's not a positive move at all as far as employment equity is concerned.
Well, would you say, though, that possibly then that the interpretation of this act by the government is a very different thing than the disabled population?
I think that the omnibus probably is going to benefit, the legislation that we're developing is going to benefit the community far more than this national strategy is. It's very weak. It's very conciliatory.
I think one of the difficulties is that the government decided that the Prime Minister would announce the overall initiative, and individual ministers are going to be announcing the parts of the package that relate to their portfolio. those announcements have by and large not yet been made. And so there's very little information out there. We don't know what's behind the words. My understanding, at least for one department, Health and Welfare, is that there is a project that they're looking at, a pilot project that could have major significance, but it hasn't been finalized yet. There's no other department in which I know of specific concrete actions that are going to have any significant impact. There might be something in the works, but we don't know about it. And I think that's one of the difficulties, that there's been an image created. We don't even know of the $158 million, how much is new money. And one of the fears that many of us have is that in fact that is really just the sum of a lot of existing money that was already in the budget, projects that were ongoing within departments that were simply pulled together, tied up with a pretty ribbon, and then are being given as a token of charity to the community of people with disabilities.
To be fair to the strategy, the Canadian Disability Rights Council did get a bit of that money to prepare this legislative package. I think we would have liked to have seen a lot more money. When you look at the Americans with Disabilities Act, they got quite a bit of money to go across the country, to talk to people with disabilities, and to launch a real awareness and public education program, as well as the money was put into developing the package more. We don't have that kind of money to work with, but we have developed a package, and we are moving forward with some money from that strategy. We're asking for people for the barriers to be removed so people can have the right to vote. Very basic rights we're asking for, and I think I'd be very disappointed if we didn't see something before Christmas on these and other issues like transportation, access to information, and that kind of thing. We need, as Carol mentioned, we need concrete deadlines, we need regulations, we need timetables, we need barrier reviews. That's what we're looking for. I think the government can deliver if the will's there.
If you want to know more about the proposed omnibus legislation, contact the Canadian Disability Rights Council. And if you wish, the Council can organize information sessions in your community. We'll give you their telephone number at the end of the show.
Coming up, a political response from Parliament Hill.
And now we're going to Parliament Hill to get some political reaction to the federal government's 5-year national strategy.
The Liberal and NDP parties are not impressed by the strategy.
Beth Phinney is the Liberal critic on disability issues. She welcomed the initiative when it was first announced, but after examining the document itself, she now questions whether the program will actually make any difference in the lives of disabled persons.
I think the day that it came out, my reaction was quite positive. I think the more I've looked at it, that I found that there is very little there. If you take $158 million and you make an announcement that's what you're giving to the disabled community, it sounds like a lot of money. But if you consider the fact it's over 5 years, which makes it $30 million a year, and then you consider they're giving it to 10 departments, and that would mean that each disabled person, since there are at least 3.3 million disabled people in Canada, would get a loonie a year. But the thing is, they're not even going to get that, because each of those departments is going to take the money and decide what programs they're going to do. And by the time they buy their staples and their cardboard that they need, or do their publicity they need for their particular program, maybe there won't be anything that actually gets out into the community.
Phinney told us that the main message she is getting from disabled people is that they want input into the decision-making process. But she is concerned that this kind of consumer input is missing from the federal program.
If you look at it carefully, there isn't anywhere in it where it says that the people with disabilities are going to be asked to come in to each of these 10 departments and give their opinion of what should be done with this money. It's going to be initiative within the department, and we can hope that they will consult.
Neil Young is the NDP critic on disability issues. He is also vice chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights and the Status of Disabled Persons. Young told us his first concern about the strategy was the lack of specifics about how the $158 million would be spent.
No one knows how that money is going to be targeted. No one's going to monitor how the money is being spent. It's not at all clear that that money is going to be fed down to programs to improve access for the disabled community into the mainstream of Canadian life. And that's the problem with it.
And finally, as you'll hear, Neil Young was not happy with the amount of money the government spent on the announcements in Winnipeg and Montreal.
On the two announcements, one in Winnipeg and one in Montreal, to announce this 5-year strategy. I mean, they flew people in from all over the country, put them up in hotels, gave them per diem for lunches and one thing and another, I suppose, limousine services from the airport to the hotel. There was 150 people in Winnipeg alone that had to cost at least $150,000 to give the Prime Minister a photo opportunity to announce this 5-year strategy. I would take a wild guess and say it cost anywhere between $250,000 and $300,000 to launch this strategy, right? Well, it seems to me that rather than all this hoopla around something that people are very skeptical about, why didn't they use the $250,000 or $300,000 and put it into programs to make polling stations accessible for disabled individuals, or a few other things that they could have done, right? So maybe that's one of the things that makes me skeptical, if not cynical, about what the government's approach is to these matters.
As Secretary of State, Robert Decotre is the key government minister responsible for implementing the national strategy for the integration of people with disabilities. For this reason, leaders in the disability community are anxious to know who they're dealing with. A question frequently asked is Decotre really interested in working with people with disabilities, or is it just another job? We had arranged for the minister to appear in today's special, but he canceled his interview with Dean at the last minute. His office said something else had come up.
At the beginning of the program, we mentioned that there hadn't been much media coverage on the Prime Minister's speech. The way the story was handled by the Ottawa Citizen in particular incensed Smokey Tompkins. Tompkins is with the National Aboriginal Network on Disability. He wrote to the paper, and his letter was selected as Letter of the Day by the Citizen.
Okay, you win. I give up. You have convinced me. I am now certain the news media are more concerned with sensationalism than with meaningful news. What convinced me is the prominent photo of the woman reported to be the mother of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's new baby on page 3, September the 7th. Right next to the picture is a small article. PM reveals $158 million strategy for disabled. Perhaps this is not a significant story for media gurus. Sadly, an item about a 71-year-old ex-Prime Minister who somehow managed to reproduce seems more attractive to Canadians than good news on disability. Let me remind you, there are 3.3 million disabled people in Canada, and most will be very pleased with the Prime Minister's announcement. In particular, Aboriginal people will benefit. Ask them, ask me. I am one of the disabled Canadians who has been waiting for the opportunities the new federal strategy represents. We need your support and understanding. That letter was to the Ottawa Citizen by Smokey Tompkins of the National Aboriginal Network on Disability.
And now, here are 2 telephone numbers where you can get more information.
If you want to know more about the national strategy, call the following number. It's toll-free, 1-800-665-9017. That's 1-800-665-9017.
And if you're interested in omnibus legislation, the Canadian Disability Rights Council can help you organize an information session in your area. They will supply you with speakers. You can reach them at area code 204-943-4787. That's 204-943-4787.
And that's our show. I'm Joe Coughlin. It's good to be back.
And I'm Susan Pettit, and it is good to be back. See you again next week.
And by the way, we'd like to hear your views on the national strategy, so you can write to us at Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. That's the Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6, or you can fax us at area code 416-975-5636.
So solving the problem is not only doing the right thing, solving the problem is also doing the intelligent thing for all Canadians. Because Canada needs the contribution of all of its citizens. We simply don't have the luxury of doing without the ideas and the creativity and the enterprise of our fellow citizens with disabilities.